Ladies and gentlemen, Neera Tandon, President and CEO of the Center for American Progress.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us. We are here today to talk about the middle class, the progress we've made, and the work that remains. And that's why we're simply thrilled to have Vice President Biden here. I cannot actually imagine a better person to be here to kick off this event. I want to start by thanking our partners at the Ford and Rockefeller Foundations for their continued support for CAP's work. I also want to recognize CAP's fantastic economic policy team who worked tirelessly to put together today's important report, Raising Wages and Rebuilding Wealth, a roadmap for middle-class economic security. As we say in this report, the American middle class is finally seeing real economic gains after more than a decade of declining economic security. In 2008, the gains the middle class made were really hit hard as years of stagnant wages and a global financial crisis plunged our economy into the worst recession our country had seen in a century. And when this president and vice president took office, our economy was hemorrhaging nearly 800,000 jobs, 800,000 jobs a month, and unemployment was nearly 10%. What's more, middle-class wealth had dropped a dramatic 49% compared to 2001, or about $83,000 for the average middle-class family. People were hurting in ways that could not be repaired quickly. But since then, we have seen incredible progress. We passed a recovery bill, boosted middle-class income through tax policy. The administration has supported small businesses, expanded health insurance coverage for millions of Americans, passed vital Wall Street reforms to stabilize our financial system and better protect American consumers. Now we have had 71 straight months of job creation and an unemployment rate which is down to 4.9%. Wages have started growing again, and wealth has rebounded by 16% or more than $14,000 for the average middle-class family. But I think we all know there's still more to do. Even though GDP per capita has grown 16%, middle-class incomes have only just returned to their 2001 levels. This comes as a cost associated with middle-class security, housing, higher education, retirement, childcare. They continue to skyrocket. And so we know that's part of the middle-class squeeze that's the focus of our report. We also know these numbers are not inevitable. Governing is about the choices we make. Do we give tax breaks to those that don't need them or raise wages for people who do? Do we protect the profits of drug companies or health of working families? Do we allow more and more wealth to flow to the hands of a few individuals at the top, or do we invest in infrastructure, college affordability, and a strong middle class that ensures everyone's income is rising? The next administration and the next Congress should build on the progress we've made these last 8 years and commit to a strong middle class agenda. And that's what today's new report is all about. And frankly, that has been the mission of our vice president. Strengthening the middle class is what Vice President Joe Biden thinks about every single day. He has often said that what makes our country special, what sets us apart from every other country in the world, is that ordinary Americans believe in extraordinary possibilities. No matter their income or their zip code, their color or their creed, and for more than 4 decades, he has fought to keep this belief alive. From the Senate to the White House, Vice President Biden has championed the issues that matter to America's middle-class families: college affordability, women's health, better wages, and retirement security. And as chair of the Middle Class Task Force and the Ready to Work initiative, he has led the administration's efforts to expand economic security. With a bold voice and really a big heart, Joe Biden has taken on the toughest challenges and had our backs at every turn. He's a man who understands the dignity of a job. He's a father who knows the importance of family, and he's a leader who fights for everyone to have a fair shot at a decent life. And most importantly, he has kept the voices of America's hardworking families in mind on every single policy decision he makes. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to the 47th Vice President of the United States, Joe Biden.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. You know, I've observed something the last 6 months. If you want to become a popular politician, announce you're not running for president. It's amazing what it does. Thank you for that warm welcome. Madam President, I could summarize the whole presentation I have this morning by saying, read your report and make sure that on January 21st, we're saying, Madam President. Thank you very much. Look, I want to make 3 basic points here, and ironically, I need not make them to you, but to the press that's here, maybe it would be worthwhile. The first one is, and the basic point is how fundamentally we differ from this Republican Party. When I say this, I mean this is not your father's Republican Party. This is a different party than it was even 25 years ago, even 20 years ago. And how we differed on crisis management, and what we inherited and how to deal with it. 2, how we we promoted the recovery, that we came from crisis to recovery, and how we fundamentally differ. And what basic pillars we have to focus on to generate a genuine resurgence in economic growth and stability for the middle class in the future. It's good to be back here. What I value most about this organization is not just your scholarship, but your passion that is matched by your scholarship, driven by a genuine sense, and all that I've met and all the people who've run this operation, by a deep concern for other people. And I compliment you on that. And I look at this first-rate report you're releasing today, from calling for higher minimum wage to workforce training programs. The report tells us what we know in our gut and what the President and I knew from the day we took office. As a matter of fact, the one question the President said, do you have any questions of me before we go forward? And I said, I just have one. Do you mean what you say about the middle class? Do you mean what you say? That it is the seminal question for our administration, is whether or not we're going to be able to restore the middle class. I know I'm referred to sometimes in this town as Middle Class Joe. That's not meant as a compliment. That's meant to mean you're not sophisticated. But I know the middle class, and I know without a growing middle class, we're in real trouble. It's the single distinguishing feature of our democracy. And the reason we talk so much about the middle class is not just about fairness, it's about stability. When the middle class is growing, we have social and political stability in this country. Look at the past 75 years of history, the past 100 years of history in this country. When other democracies, great democracies, have been shaken, it's in large part because they haven't had that sense. I was asked by President Xi, who I've spent more time with, they tell me, than anybody else, any other world leader. We were in Chengdu. She was traveling with me. And it was a private dinner, and he said, can you define America for me? And I said, yeah, I can do it in one word. And I mean this sincerely. One word: possibilities. Possibilities. That's what the middle class is all about. That's what they're all about. You know, when they do well, when the middle class does well, the wealthy do very, very well, and the poor have a leg up. They have a chance. And let me explain what I mean by middle class before we get much further. Middle class is not a number. A number of economists in here, and the economists that work for me, I'll say middle class, they'll say, well, $51,250 or $52,500. It's not a number. It's a value set. It's about being able to own your home and not just rent it if you wish to own a home. It means to be able to send your kid to a local park and know they're going to come home safely. It means to be able to send your kid to a high school that if they do well, they can get to college. If they can get to college, you'll find a way to be able to afford to get them there. And it means when one of your parents dies, you'll be able to take care of the other one. and hope your children never, ever, ever have to take care of you. That's middle class in America. But you all know that. You know, before we took office, as Neera pointed out, the middle class was being clobbered. Before the President and I lowered our hands after putting our left hand in the Bible and raising our right hand, we had already lost 700,000 jobs that month. We ended up losing 800 in the remaining 9 days or 10 days. There was talk of another depression. I remember the first meeting we had with the 50 economists we put together in the interregnum period to give us advice. The first meeting we had in the 70th floor or whatever it was in Chicago, the offices we had. They came in and they said, Mr. President, President, they called him Senator. Senator, we thought we were going to come in and tell you that you should declare a bank holiday. But we think we don't have to do that, but here's what we have to do. Everybody forgets how bad things were. And so we made some really tough, really unpopular decisions. Really unpopular decisions with your help, your backing. I literally had to talk a friend of mine, Arnold Specter, into changing political parties in order to pass the Recovery Act, which ended up being over $800 billion of stimulus spent in 18 months. But these decisions we made, every one of which was opposed by our Republican friends, pulled the economy out of the depths of a crisis into recovery. And all along the way, we challenged every bit of Republican orthodoxy to get there. Republicans talked about stimulus like it was a dirty word. As a matter of fact, they succeeded at the front end, convincing people that the Recovery Act was just a boondoggle, a waste of government money, a waste of their taxes. We rejected it. We passed the Recovery Act, and we ended up injecting $831 billion into the economy within 18 months. Rebuilding our infrastructure, saving our local schools from deep cuts and teaching staffs, getting tax cuts for families on the brink. And you know, all with, according to the Government Accountability Office, less than 0.2% of waste or fraud or abuse. The single most significant spending program in the history of the United States, maybe of the world. I don't know that last to be factual. And it was done with incredible alacrity as well as without waste. Republicans accepted that the U.S. auto industry, and some of you in this room did too, quite frankly, that it was going to wither, arguing that the federal government had no role to play. They said that we'd never sell more than 6 million cars again in America. And they rejected the notion that extending the lifeline to auto workers, they viewed as totally non-productive, being paid too much, sounds like Donald Trump, workers are paid too much, being paid too much, that they could compete. Auto workers made incredible sacrifices to make that recovery of the automobile industry work. We saved 1 million jobs. In the process, we've created just in that year another 671,000 additional jobs at GM and Chrysler as they came out of bankruptcy. The fastest growth on record. And these are middle-class jobs. You can raise a family on the wages of these jobs. Last year, we sold 17,500,000 motor vehicles, more than any time in all history. It was a failure. We made a mistake, as Mr. Trump and others have said. Republican argues that emergency support for unemployed workers was going to, I love how they view the guys I grew up with and the family I grew up in. It would just discourage them to work, like they like sitting home doing nothing. They don't get. I really mean this. This is the one thing that offended me in the campaign we're running. They don't understand how extraordinary, ordinary Americans are and what their value set is. So we rejected their idea that the American people don't want to work. They're out of work, most of them through no fault of their own. So we expanded unemployment insurance, not once but twice, saving millions of households while they continued to search for new jobs. Republicans wanted more tax cuts for the wealthy. They thought the answer was, and they're not bad guys, they thought the answer was a great way to continue to grow the economy, to start to grow the economy again, was cut capital gains, cut taxes on dividends. They didn't support the tax cuts for families, for workers, for small businesses. We rejected all of this, and we passed 18 tax cuts for small businesses. 2 years in a row, cuts in the payroll taxes. Lifting people above the water. $100 billion in tax cuts each of those years for hardworking Americans and small businesses. Every single American who worked got a raise. The problem we had, and it's our fault, we're so worried of getting things done, we didn't advertise what we did. I remember being up in New York State and doing a thing on renewable energy with a whole group of people in New York City, and one businessman said, "You know, I want to thank you." My housekeeper came up to me and said, "Thanks for the raise," because her payroll taxes were less. Thanks for the raise. But it helped. It made a difference in the everyday lives of ordinary Americans. Republicans argued that any more regulation on Wall Street would destabilize the financial sector, and it would put banks out of business. We rejected that idea. We passed sweeping financial reform through Dodd-Frank to rationally regulate what had been the best allocator of capital in the history of the world, Wall Street. And we did it in order to promote financial stability, to protect working Americans from predatory practices. In short, to prevent another crash. Republicans believe that health care is a privilege, not a right, and that if we moved on a federal system for health care, that it would bankrupt America. We had a fundamentally different view. We knew the driver of the national debt more than anything else was health care cost. We believed from the beginning that health care was a right, not a privilege, just like education, basic education in America is a right, not a privilege. So we passed the Affordable Care Act with your help, driving down the growth of health care costs to the lowest in half a century. 20 million people, previously uninsured, covered. We now have the lowest uninsured rate on record in the country. We could make the Affordable Care Act better if they'd be willing to work with us. But the Affordable Care Act did give millions of Americans something even more important than access to health care, which, again, these guys don't get because I don't think they live in this area. It gave them peace of mind. Peace of mind. Hillary and I talk about this. We talk about how many people would go to bed staring at the ceiling thinking, my God, if my wife lying next to me gets breast cancer, do we lose everything? If I end up with colon cancer, if I end up with a heart disease, we lose everything. Everything. There's nothing you can give an individual or family more than peace of mind. They don't know my neighborhood that I grew up in. They don't know what average Americans are thinking. Republicans think that government, federal, state, and local, doesn't have a role in training workers for 21st century jobs. William Butler Yeats, in his poem Easter Sunday, 1960, describing his Ireland at the time, how it's changed, he said, he has a line in it that better describes the world today than it did his Ireland in 1960. He said, all's changed utterly. A terrible beauty has been born. All has changed in terms of the jobs of the future. We talked about in the 80s, the information age. By the time the government caught up with it, it had already passed. What are we doing now? We're finally beginning to focus on, in this administration, the phenomenal impact on the job market by everything from a global economy to the digitalization of everything. But guess what? The same man or woman who had the intellectual and personal capacity to put coal into a blast furnace has the capacity to learn about photovoltaic technology to make shingles that are solar shingles. Doesn't take much. They have the intellectual capacity to do this. They just need to be retrained. We concluded that we had to have a workforce fully capable of the challenges of the jobs of the future. All people need is just a chance. That's why we invested in retraining programs. Not government-sponsored retraining programs. We went to businesses. You all know, if you ask all the CEOs, and there's some good ones, and they're not some not so, I don't mean morally, there's some good ones that know what they're doing and some that don't. What's the one thing you hear from the most conservative or to the most moderate businessman running a corporation? What do you need most? We need an educated workforce, right? That's what I get all the time. The problem is we don't have an educated workforce. They told us 3 years ago we needed 100,000 high-tech skilled manufacturing jobs. We're going on unfilled. So with no Republican help, we went out and we said, okay, you decide what you need. We'll couple you with a community college. We'll provide funding. You bring your machinery. You write the program. You go into the school. You put together 14-week, 20-week, 27-week programs. We can create an assembly line for you for trained workers, retrained workers, to be able to make a decent wage doing high-tech manufacturing. I was up in Michigan, Detroit. We need 1,200,000 IT workers. So they went into the global IT that places, some of you guys may know it, places IT workers in jobs. So they went out and they put together, I think it was a 15-week program in Detroit. They went into the hood. I mean the neighborhoods. I went to see the program, the graduation day. I think it was 14, could have been 16 weeks. Every single person, coincidentally, in that room was an African-American woman. No one with more than a high school degree, most with GEDs. They learned how to code. Every single one left there with a job. The lowest paying job, $56,000, the highest, 101. You tell me people don't want to work or can't work? Don't have the capacity? When have we ever given the American people a chance that they've ever let the country down? I mean that sincerely. That's not nativism, that's not chauvinism, it's just a simple fact. As my wife says, and she's in the classroom today at a community college teaching, she's never stopped. She says, any country that out-educates us will out-compete us. That's why we made the largest investment. You know, when we wrote the Recovery Act, the President and I actually sat down ourselves on that alone. It wasn't just to infuse that money into the economy to keep it from collapsing, but it was to change the way we governed. We made some really substantial changes in there. People forget, except you guys, we invested $100 billion in education in that Recovery Act. $100 billion. The largest infusion of education money in history. What was happening? Schools were closing. Teachers were laid off in massive numbers. Classroom sizes were going from 25 to 45. Children were losing the effect of an entire year. But the federal government came in, provided this help. We now have the highest graduation rates in history for African Americans and Latinos. 3 million more students are in college from low-income households right now because of what you did, what we did. Helping 9 million students be able to stay in college through the tax credit. 9 million middle-class families, knowing they could take $2,500 off the bottom line per kid, able to struggle to keep their kid in school. This Republican Party is different than when I started as a 29-year-old kid in the Senate. Republicans used to support payment for overtime work. They used to support a minimum wage. They used to call for raises in minimum wage. They used to support workplace safety. There used to be a basic bargain in America, shared by Republicans and Democrats, differing in degree, but the premise was shared. The basic bargain was, if you work to increase the productivity or the profit of the outfit you were with, you got to benefit from that productivity and that profit. This is not your father's Republican Party, as I said before. They reverted to attitudes that had been jettisoned in the 40s by their party. They argued the workforce protections actually hurt economic growth and stymied business growth and investment, and much more. We rejected these notions. We administratively changed the regulations that if you work overtime, you get paid for overtime. We fought for a higher minimum wage. We didn't get it federally, but we talked about it so much the states stepped up, many of them. But there's more to do. We insisted on workforce protections, paid leave. And as your report points out, there's so much more to do. We can't turn back now. The results, 7.5 years later, middle-class economics has worked. The bleeding has stopped. The economy went from crisis to recovery, and we're on the cusp of genuine resurgence now. As Neera pointed out, unemployment is below 5%. Real wages are actually growing again, not as much as they need to, but growing again. Finally, deficits have been slashed. We've recovered more than $32 trillion in household wealth. Unfortunately, it's been disproportionately recovered. Not because of policy, because if you lost your home and the real estate market is back, you have nothing to get back. So it's those of us who are able to keep our homes that are now back. If you had any money in the stock market, you were scared the hell out of it, you lost it all from your 401k on if you didn't, and you didn't stay in the market. The market went from about down around 6,000 to over 18,000. And so there is the unintended disproportionate impact on income inequality. That wasn't part of a policy. It was part of the rubble left behind by a recession created by the policies of the previous administration. As Neera pointed out, 15.1 million private sector jobs created over the past 78 months. More jobs than every other industrialized nation in the world combined. I spent a lot of time overseas. I got picked because allegedly I'm an expert in foreign policy. An expert's anyone from out of town with a briefcase. I don't have a briefcase with me today, okay? But I meet with an awful lot of world leaders. We were pushing the hell out of Europe and the EU to expand and invest. Look at where we are, in some cases going 20 times as fast as other countries. Not done yet. Haven't answered it all. But we're sure in hell right. We're right in the direction. But as I said, there's so much more we have to do to help families get into the middle class and stay there. And the surest way to do that is to increase productivity and economic growth. EJ, I love Republicans talking about how they, in fact, are the party of increased productivity and growth. as I once inappropriately said, give me a break. Let's talk about, from my perspective, what, well, you know, there are basically 5 pillars, in my view, that we need to focus on to make sure this resurgence continues and grows. The first is we need, there's a need worldwide for increased access to affordable education and job training. And the need exists more today than it ever has in our history. Cognitive capability, as opposed to brawn, is the means by which you can climb the ladder in the middle of the class, in the middle class. When I say education, I'm talking about early education, I'm talking about lifelong education, I'm talking about affordable education, and I'm talking about accessible education. In today's economy, there's going to be a constant requirement from this moment on for workers to retool and retrain, even for the jobs they now possess, to be able to keep those jobs. The technology they've engaged with is moving faster than the ability of anyone to keep up without additional education. It's just a fact. As I said, it's particularly the case in the area of IT, advanced manufacturing, healthcare, energy. We need lifelong education. And this education and training is not only an obligation of our government, it's also a responsibility of businesses. You may remember when the president, I always worry sitting behind him in the State of the Union, because he always turns at some point and says, and Joe will do the following, without having told me to do the following. When we did the Recovery Act, I wrote him with the help of Ron Klain, an 8-page memo. We had lunch. I slipped it down to him and told him how we should do it and what I thought we had to do to make sure it worked. He slipped it back and said, go ahead and do it. You know, last time he talked about the Recovery Act, you know. Well, you know, he sat there a couple years ago and said, and Joe is going to write a report on what the jobs of the future are and what we should be focusing on. We interviewed, including Commerce and others helping me, over 350 of the Fortune 500 CEOs, labor unions. We went all over the country, educational institutions. And we were able to list, with some degree of certainty is turning out to be true, what were those jobs that were going to be coming up. We need 680,000 more registered nurses. We need, I mean, I won't go through it all, but you know the report because you guys helped write it, quite frankly. Well, unless we train to those standards and make available that training. I used to have a friend who was a great basketball player when Providence College had those great teams. And there was a guy named Walker and Reardon. There were 2 all-pros, all-Americans. This guy played, and I was the 6th man on that team. His name is Pete McLaughlin. And he was a great guy, great friend of mine, died of throat cancer when he was 50, but much too soon. And, but he wasn't the brightest academic candle on the table, but he was a smart guy. He used to have an expression, you got to know how to know. He'd say, Joe, you got to know how to know. I can take you in the Library of Congress, unless you can figure out how to access the card catalog, it doesn't mean much to you. It's of no use to you. So one of the things we spend a lot of time doing is acquainting workers who are desperately looking for another job or a way to improve their standing as to where those jobs are. That's a hard thing, not as easy as it appeared, but it's really working. The second thing we have to do is we need to guarantee basic protection for workers. And by the way, on the education side of the equation, before I leave that, the president and I and Hillary are talking about free community college and college education. Now, I don't know anybody, I don't know any businessman or woman, I don't know any conservative Republican who really believes that 12 years of education is enough in the 21st century to compete. But let's take just one proposal we have about productivity. Everybody will tell you the more community college graduates, advanced degree graduates you have, the more likely productivity will increase and the GDP will grow. That's what we need. So we came along and said, look, we want to provide free community college, only those colleges where all your credits are able to be transferred to a four-year university. So we insisted on the quality of the community college as well. And we said it's going to move from 6 million to 9 million students in community colleges. And the effect is going to be that it costs $6 billion a year to do that. And immediately our Republican friends go, oh my God, we can't do that. Well, when Reagan was president, there were about $800 billion in tax expenditures in the code. There are now $1.3 trillion in tax expenditures in the code. What's the purpose of a tax expenditure? To increase what is viewed by the society as a social good, or to increase productivity and growth? I challenge anybody to find for more than $600 to $700 billion in our tax code expenditures that actually generates economic growth. So we should eliminate some of them. For example, we call for eliminating stepped-up basis. I hope all of you know what it is. I didn't know what it was when I was a kid. It means if your old man leaves you $1 million in stock, he buys $1 million worth of stock, it's worth $2 million 4 years later, he's on his way to sell it, he drops dead. If he had not dropped dead, he'd have to pay capital gains on $1 million. If he drops dead, you inherit it, you don't pay anything. These are good people, they're not bad people. I won't punish anybody. You pay nothing. You know how much that costs the federal government every year? $17 billion in taxes not collected. They would have collected if Dad sold it instead of you selling it. Well, guess what? I can pay for free community college for every single student in America going to a community college and cut the deficit by $11 billion while I'm doing it. We need to make sure there's a living wage out there. Overtime pay, child care tax credit, sick leave, the right to unionize, collectively bargain. Government has an obligation to strengthen these protections. Corporations also have an obligation. It's a notion some business leaders believe in and that are growing now. I met with a number of CEOs who asked to come and see me at my home to talk about corporate responsibility. These are some of the Fortune 30 companies. Some of them call it inclusive capitalism, social capitalism. They argue that, informed CEOs argue that a worker's well-being and a business' well-being go hand in hand. That when business accounts for the interest of their workers, the environment, the community, everybody benefits, including their shareholders. I don't have to tell anyone in this room that over the last few decades, there's been a real change in corporate culture, particularly the way businesses invest their profits. A study published by the Harvard Business Journal last year, done by a guy out of the University of Massachusetts, pointed out that in the last decade, it actually was 2003 to 2013, if I'm not mistaken, 449 companies who remained in the Fortune 500 list for that entire 10 years. Over that period, they made $2.4 trillion in profit. That's a really good thing. But because of short-termism and a lot of changes at the SEC during the Reagan administration, the study showed that 54% of that profit went to buying back their own stock, their own company shares. One of the mistakes, when, sometimes good intentions are so bad, President Clinton talking about limiting wages to CEOs to $1 million is a big mistake. So they get paid now in stock. I think it's something like 87% get paid, the bulk of their pay is in stock options. And it's big. So there's an incentive to buy back your own stock, man. It raises the value of the stock. They're not bad guys. The market provides incentives. 37% of that profit went to shareholders. Shareholders are good people. Matter of fact, I got a cartoon in my office. I think you saw it, EJ, and a couple other reporters here when they came in to interview me. And it's a picture out of the New Yorker of a guy, a very rotund guy in a black turtleneck sweater, a black mask, a black skull cap. And he's sitting at the table being interrogated. There's a big bag with a $sign on it. And he's looking at the interrogator. He said, "How was I supposed to know he was a job creator?" Since when were shareholders the only job creators? When the hell did that happen? When did that happen? So after the rewarding of 36%, which is not a bad thing, 37% actually, or shareholders, that left 9% of all that profit for everything else, for research, development, reserves, raises, training of employees. And the way the vacuum has been filled, they borrow money for nothing. And they get their company further in debt. And that's progress. That's productivity. That's growth. There's an increasing chorus of business leaders who argue that stock buybacks are inhibiting investment, discouraging productivity. Look, the point is really basic. What's good for workers is good for business, is good for the productivity, is good for society. There's nothing about it that doesn't recognize and support and reinforce capital markets. The third thing we have to do is modernize our infrastructure. I realize you're tired of hearing me talk about this at every fora for the last 7 years. But you all know the numbers. I won't go through them all. Society of Engineers estimates there's a need for at least $3.6 trillion in new investment by 2020 to maintain and increase the infrastructure, to modernize and upgrade it so we have a 21st infrastructure. We're not going to get there. A.T. Kearney and Boston Consulting Group's two different outfits point out corporate America's coming home. Your kids, God willing, are going to be talking about insourcing, not outsourcing. Why? Because we have the most agile venture capitalist system in the world. We have the greatest research universities in the world. We have the cheapest energy in the world. And you're going to maintain that, an abundance of it. We have the most productive workers in the world. They're 3 times as productive as they are in Asia. They're coming home. But how long are they going to stay home if we don't, in fact, end up with the 21st century infrastructure? Businesses are going to invest and stay where they can get product to the factory floor as quick as they can and as cheaply as they can and out to the market. Any of you who have advised local councilmen or mayors, what's the first thing, what are they all doing? When business is talking about to relocate in their area, what's your water supply? You're near a railhead. Do you have the highway access? I mean, this isn't rocket science. For the longest time in the United States Senate, the leading proponents of, in Congress, of investment in infrastructure were Republicans. What happened? What happened? And the studies you produce, it generates a virtuous cycle. They get good paying jobs. They invest in the economy. They go out and buy things. The economy grows. But unless we invest in infrastructure, we're going to be left behind. I know a lot of you thought I was too blunt when I said that if I blindfolded you and put you in an airport in Beijing and an airport at LaGuardia Airport and asked you which in the middle of the night and took the blindfold off and said, where are you? You'd say the third world country or the emerging economy was LaGuardia. Everybody got really upset, except the mayor, the governor, the folks who worked at the airport, who ran the airport. What really drove me crazy, I remember going through and seeing a sign on the escalator saying, will be repaired by January. And seriously, the greatest city in the world, literally, with a third-rate infrastructure. Well, now they're investing billions of dollars to grow it. Companies invest, as I said, where they can get to market quickly. The fourth thing we have to do, and maybe one of the most important, is we need a more progressive and effective tax structure, tax code. And I said it's not just about fairness, it's also about increasing productivity. And I can give you a whole bunch of examples. I love my Republican friends when they start talking about, they're for productivity. There are hundreds of thousands, millions, several millions of women who are fully qualified to be in the workforce. If they were in the workforce, they would increase the growth in GDP about 0.2%. But they're not there. Why? Because of the cost of child care. In a city like Washington and major metropolitan areas, it can range from $16,000 to $22,000 a year for 2 kids. So we say what we should do is we should invest in a greater tax credit, a larger tax credit for child care across the board. What do these guys say? No. But to continue to keep tax breaks in the code that have no relevance to growth. None. I'm sorry to get off on this so much because it drives me crazy, but I'll skip to the end here. Look, our Republican friends, they're not bad guys. And I'm one of those Democrats who actually likes a lot of them, okay? They really are my friends. If you notice, every time we're in trouble, I get sent up to the hill. You think I'm kidding, check the record. Okay? But they say they support tax fairness in this election. They say they are for growing the middle class. They say they're for increasing education opportunities. But they have a different value set than we do. It's just a basic thing. They have a different value set. My dad used to have an expression. When someone comes to my dad and say, "Joe, let me tell you what I value," he'd say, "No, show me your budget. I'll tell you what you value. Don't tell me what you value. Show me your budget. I will tell you what you value." Let's take a look at what they say they value. Everything they propose in the Ryan budget and in the Trump budget. And the reason I say the Ryan budget has been voted for in the House since the Republicans control the House. They vote for it and they pass it in the House. Thank God it's not passed beyond that. But what do they call for? Almost everything they call for drives down the standard of living of middle-class people. And by the way, I'm not just talking about the $51,000 people. I'm talking about the husband and wife, each having a job making $60,000, $70,000, $80,000, $90,000 a year, having real trouble making it. So what do they call for? They want to privatize Social Security, cut Social Security. We have to do something about Social Security, and I think we should be, I won't go into what I think, but I think we have to make some difficult decisions. But privatize it? They voucherize Medicare. What does that do? Lower the standard of living for middle-class people. Less access. Less support. They also say that they want to make sure that women are in the workforce. They oppose changing the child care tax credit. They oppose the fair pay legislation. They say that they really think that what we really need to do is we have an obligation to support local law enforcement. I love how these guys are all for law enforcement now. It's just fascinating. When for the past 15 years, they've argued there is no role for the federal government in local law enforcement. None. That's why they opposed the cops bill. That's why in the Bush administration, they cut federal support for local law enforcement by 50%. That's why they voted against our efforts to increase money for community policing. We're wasting so many opportunities to grow this economy by continuing the unproductive and unfair way in which these guys look at what, quote, they value. And ladies and gentlemen, when the standard of living plummets, when your neighborhood is unsafe, when you can't send your kids out to play in the local playground knowing they're going to come home safely, it is a fundamental reduction in your standard of living. And I said they're not bad guys, but they don't understand. Right now, and I'll conclude with this, I wonder how many tens of thousands of conversations took place in the middle-class neighborhoods like I grew up in all across America at the kitchen table this morning. And I promise you, hundreds of thousands of them went like this, were people making what are viewed to be a joint income that is decent, $70,000, $80,000, $90,000 a year. John, we need new tires on the car. We got to get 10,000 more miles out of those tires now. We can't afford them now. Mary, who's going to tell our daughter she can't go back to Penn State this year? She's got to switch to the community college. We can't afford it. Who's going to tell her? And if you live in Washington, get out of Washington. They're the conversations that are going on all around America with decent, honorable, hardworking, employed families. Dealing with income inequity is not just about fairness. It's about economic growth. It's not just Joe Biden or CAP, or it's the IMF, it's Standard & Poor's. They understand the concentration of wealth is a threat to growth, economic expansion. So folks, I should conclude where I should have begun by just saying thank you. Thank you for your scholarship. Thank you for your commitment. Thank you for your advocacy. You are the single most significant center of progressive notions and values that exist, not in this city, but in this country. And you're changing attitudes. You're changing politics. You're changing how we view things. And as my grandfather used to say, with the grace of God, the goodwill of the neighbors, and the creek not rising, you're going to elect Hillary Clinton president, because if you don't, we're in trouble. Thank you all very much. God bless you all. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Mark Drosilik. I'm the Vice President for Economic Policy here at CAP. I'd like to begin by saying a thank you to the Vice President for those remarks and for his tremendous and longstanding commitment to the middle class and those who aspire to enter it. As Neera Tanden noted, CAP has just released a new report on raising wages and rebuilding wealth. And this report does two things. First, it tells the story of what's happened to middle-class wages and wealth. And that story goes a long way toward explaining the current economic and political atmosphere. As we show in the report, since the mid-70s, stagnant real wages have been the norm for middle-class households. Except for the 1990s, when real wage growth accounted for about 3/4 of earnings growth, households have managed to increase their incomes only by working more hours. But from 2000, when women's labor force participation stopped growing, middle-class household incomes stagnated. The economic shock of the financial crisis and the Great Recession turned income stagnation into income decline. And it also devastated middle-class wealth. Between 2001 and 2010, average middle-class net worth fell by half. This all occurred against the backdrop of 3 decades of increasing costs for the big ticket items of middle-class necessities, like childcare, higher education, housing, and more. As the economy has recovered, middle-class incomes have returned to about year 2000 levels, but middle-class wealth, while rebounding, has a good ways to go. So it's no mystery that middle-class households feel challenged and frustrated about their economic situation. The second aim of our report is to advance a policy agenda that addresses these challenges, that lays out a roadmap for raising wages, lowering costs, and rebuilding wealth. On how to raise wages, we propose ideas to use fiscal and monetary policy to run a high-pressure, full-employment economy, including making major investments in infrastructure. To change labor market rules to increase worker bargaining power, share profits with workers, and invest in worker training. To rewrite the incentives driving our corporations and financial markets so that they will compete and invest for the long term. The report also advances proposals to deal with the rising costs of middle-class essentials, including ideas to make childcare affordable, increase access to affordable education, and reduce the cost of healthcare. We think this agenda is vitally important and deserves to be part of the policy debate in the coming year. To bring this agenda into focus, we've invited a distinguished panel of experts to critically examine some of the ideas we've advanced, and it's my pleasure to introduce that panel to you now. On the panel are Sarah Bloom Raskin, the very distinguished Deputy Secretary of Treasury and former Federal Reserve Governor, who's been a powerful voice on behalf of student borrowers and consumers, financial stability, cybersecurity, workers, and the economy. Professor Ellen Blinder, the Gordon Rentschler Memorial Professor of Economics and Public Affairs at Princeton, former Vice Chair of the Federal Reserve, whose insightful analysis of the financial system and the economy continue to put him at the forefront of America's economic thinking. Dean Edward Montgomery of the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown, former Deputy Secretary of Labor, whose leadership in the automobile rescue saved millions of jobs. Elizabeth Schuler, the Secretary-Treasurer and CFO of the AFL-CIO, whose leadership has resulted in such programs as the Next Up Youth Young Workers Initiative. And E.J. Dionne, Senior Fellow at Brookings and the author of the recent New York Times bestseller, Why the Right Went Wrong, Conservatism from Goldwater to Trump and Beyond, which has just come out in paperback. And with that, I will turn things over to the CEO of CAP and the prime mover behind much of our economic research, Neera Tanden, who will moderate this discussion.
Thanks, Mark. Thank you. I hope everyone's received a copy of the report. We're going to get right into this panel because we are running a little bit behind schedule, as you all might have noticed. But of course, having the words of the Vice President, every single word is worth it. So this is an incredibly distinguished panel, and I'm honored to be here with you all. I think I'm going to try and get a little bit of a conversation going. I'll ask a question or two of each of us, and then we'll have a few minutes for Q&A from the audience in the time we have. So I'm just going to get into it quickly. First with you, Deputy Secretary Raskin. The Vice President did a kind of phenomenal roadmap of what has been accomplished, but also what needs to happen as he discussed the 5 pillars, which wonderfully overlap with the CAP report. I think one broad question a lot of people are asking is, what is actually happening with the economy? Why do we continue to see some of the polarization? It's definitely gotten better. Wages are rising, middle-class wages are rising. But what are the key steps you see for us to take going forward to address the challenges around rising inequality?
So thank you, Neera, and congratulations on the report. I think the report is actually hitting so many of the important drivers that are, in essence, creating real hardship for the middle class. And I think the pivot that is suggested, both in the report and certainly in the Vice President's remarks, has to do with maxing out a little bit more on some of the tools that we have available. So I think we have done quite a bit, and I think the accomplishments speak well in terms of what we are seeing now in terms of our long stagnant middle class wages starting to nudge up somewhat, and that is all to the good. But the real call, I think, that you're hearing from the Vice President is that we cannot be complacent, that there is more to be done here. And in particular, I think his call and CAP's call for infrastructure spending is really the piece that I think we should put some concerted attention towards. If you think back in terms of the pre-crisis experience and certainly the immediate post-crisis experience, the primary tools really for the economy have been a very maximal use of monetary policy, as we've seen through many of the Fed's a very strong, accommodative, and unorthodox, but working well policies, as well as a whole host of structural tools. So we have done quite a bit in terms of fixing some of the hardships and problems that came through the crisis, loud and clear, and you've seen that in a lot of the structural work that has been looked at. I think the piece, though, that we want to give some focus on now is kind of the next step really is the infrastructure spending.
Okay.
And if you think about infrastructure and middle-class wages, there's a direct linkage. And we obviously all intuitively understand how infrastructure spending is, in essence, a shot in the arm. It's a stimulus measure. It boosts demand. The piece, though, that I think really needs to be understood much more carefully is the productivity piece, because infrastructure really is the key to bringing about better productivity. Infrastructure spending is, after all, really enhancing the ways we do commerce. It is, to use the Vice President's words, when people want to invest in a town, they're going to look at the water supply, they're going to look at the roads, they're going to look at the schools, they're going to look at how educated people are, they're going to look at whether there's good ways for mothers to go back to work. All of these pieces constitute infrastructure. And what I think our deficit now can clearly support is this idea of doing more spending on valuable infrastructure that will have a link to productivity, that will then keep up the momentum that we're starting to see on middle-class wages.
That's really great. Thank you so much. Professor Blander, I love your insights as to why we are kind of continuing to see this disconnect between again, it's a disconnect that's declining, but still there between economic growth writ large and how middle-class families are experiencing that growth.
Yeah, I'd like to underscore just what you said. It is finally declining a little bit, but this is after decades of widening. So we have, in that respect, gone down a deep rabbit hole and are just inching up a little. I think I'd like to just say two things. I mean, there's been volumes written on that. Economists have this wonkish term, skill-biased technical progress, which in plain English means the economy, the market economy has moved over decades, this is not the last few years, in ways that are more beneficial to the people at the top than to the people at the bottom. The government didn't do that. The market did it. Basically, it's technology and globalization driven. But for much of that period, the government did A, nothing to mitigate it, and B, to some extent piled on with, for example, making the tax code less progressive. I'm not talking, obviously, about the last 7 years, but we had many years before that. I thought that was outrageous, actually, given, so this was going to be a hard thing to combat by government anyway, but you get the government actually pushing in the wrong direction and making it worse rather than better. So that can be changed. You can start making it better rather than worse without even living with the skill bias technical progress. which you attack to some extent by the education and things like that that the vice president was talking about. But you have minimum wages, you have profit sharing, which the government can push, and as you know, Hillary Clinton is pushing that idea. You have improvements in the earned income tax credit. You covered a lot of these things in the report. So around the edges, there are a whole bunch of things the government can do to mitigate rather than exacerbate this this market force. And I think, you know, that's the kind of progressive agenda that we want. The last thing I want to say is to come back. Sarah mentioned this. Is there was one, and Mark mentioned this. There was one brief shining moment of about 4 years where we got that process stopped. And that was in the super tight labor markets of the second Clinton term. The first, we still didn't have tight enough labor markets. In the second Clinton term, the labor markets really tightened. We got the unemployment rate down to 3.9%, which you may remember, which I never thought I'd see in my lifetime. Again, I saw it. I'm old enough to remember the 60s, unfortunately. So we had it then. I never thought I'd see it again, but we did see it again. And that was the one interval in which this trend towards more and more inequality halted. So we can get back to that with some difficulty. This comes to the fiscal stimulus that Sarah was just talking about. She mentioned the Fed, but you know, I hate to say this as a big proponent of the Fed, and Janet Yellen wouldn't want me to say they're out of bullets, but they don't have many bullets left. Let's put it that way. So for many years, we've been just leaning on the Fed. You do this job to the best you can. And I think we basically played that almost as much as we can. It's time for the fiscal side to step up to the plate.
That's very helpful. Professor Montgomery, or should I call you Dean Montgomery? You know, we obviously are very focused on the middle class as an engine of economic growth, but I don't want to leave the impression that this is completely divorced from people who are still struggling to get into the middle class, because obviously for most of our history, a strong middle class has actually been something that has helped a lot of people get into it. So lower income Americans have done well when the middle class is pretty strong as well. I'd love for you to perhaps call attention to issues or policies that would make a big difference in getting more lower income folks to be able to climb up the mobility ladder.
So I guess I would start with one, applauding the fact that we've turned around, we've reversed the hemorrhaging that we've been engaged in, that the Great Recession started. For somebody who spent a lot of time in Flint and in Detroit and in other auto cities, the picture in 2009, 2010 was as depressing as you can get. That's changed. That's come back. It's beginning to come back. Part of what to bring it back is a strong, vibrant economy. An absolutely necessary condition to get the middle class wages growing, to get lower class workers' wages going, is a strong, vibrant economy. That's why I'll second your infrastructure investment. It both helps grow the economy, but also increases the productivity of the economy. You need more than that to reach the lower income individuals, other than a vibrant economy. You need to fix our cities. Partly an infrastructure issue, partly investing in places like Detroit, in places like Flint, so that you create vibrant economies for lower income people. You have to fix the education system. You have to make sure that K through 12 works. You have to have access to primary education, pre-K education. You have to make sure that college for low income, for poor people, is a viable option. Community colleges, which is a big source of where they go to school, that they're free or that they're low cost, that they can get into them and their families can afford them. These are big parts of things which you can target. And you have to protect people, immigrants, particularly. We need comprehensive immigration reform. They're a big chunk of that population. They will be a source of growth if we can get them out of the shadows. They'll be a source of gains for both them and other low-wage workers. Because right now, when they're in the shadows, employers are able to exploit them. If we can get them out of the shadows, it helps them, it raises their income, and raises the income for other low-wage workers as well.
That's fantastic. Liz, can you help us think through what the disparity here is on worker voice, worker power, I mean, one sag we see is that high-skilled workers who can demand higher wages because of their skill set, frankly, our wages are increasing. Most other workers who don't have that voice themselves aren't able to bargain for higher wages. So walk us through the union aspect of this, or why that matters for wages for everybody, not just union employees.
Sure, absolutely. First of all, thank you. I want to thank CAP and NERA. Your leadership has been tremendous, and this report is exactly what we need at the right time in this debate. So we want to say thank you and for really listening, because you've been a tremendous partner. The labor movement obviously cares very deeply about these issues. And you're right, the idea that unions have been in decline, it's no secret. We would say that the income distribution chart tracks exactly the union decline chart, right? That as workers have bargaining powers declined, especially in unions, their share of the pie has shrunk, and they haven't been able to demand like they have in the past. And so we think it's absolutely critical, and we thank you for including collective bargaining in the report, because only through collective voice and bringing people together, we know are better off together than they are individually, right? And I always think of Donald Trump. When you go into his office to ask for a raise, what does he say? You're fired, right? But if you go in with other workers together, you're able to lift standards and demand more. And so I think that is the bottom line, that unions do that. The problem is it's incredibly difficult to form a union with the state of labor law today. So we need to address that. We need to, continue to build the ability to collectively bargain, but we also need to use the tools we have at our disposal to create movements and collective voice, even beyond what the law and the policy provides. And, I would point to some of the actions that we've seen in the streets with the Fight for 15, and, the idea that unions working with community partners can actually change standards and things like procurement law, like we've seen, with the Jobs to Move America initiative, where unions and community and faith leaders are all coming together to say we should demand more from, the monies that we're investing, the tax dollars we're investing in our communities, and making sure that good jobs are a part of that equation. So that, I believe, is the role of unions. Now, how we get back and restore more access to that is the big question, and not just for union members, but for workers more broadly. And clearly, getting tough on employers who are violating the law, making sure we're finding new ways to cooperate and bring people together by sector, so that we're not just bargaining for a discrete set of workers in one place of employment, but actually looking at, how do we build strategies that really provide voice and power for workers in entire industries.
That's great. EJ, I would love to just focus on a kind of broader theme with you, which is you have written extensively about rising inequality and issues like social trust, and what that means for our democracy. And I'd love for you to give us your thoughts on the discussion we've had and your sort of one-sided soliloquy with the vice president, but also give us a sense of why these issues matter, not only from an economic growth perspective, but from a democracy perspective, and also, what we're seeing in the debate and the election today.
Thank you so much. First of all, I want to say that given all the work you have done and Mark has done and the whole CAP staff, Middle Class Joe will now get a run from Middle Class Nira and Middle Class Mark and Middle Class David Madland, my former student.
Yes,
so thank you
great.
For this work. Second, what do we call Ed Montgomery? I have the honor of teaching at the McCourt School, so I call him Boss Montgomery, and I am so happy I have such a pro-worker boss. And the last thing I want to say, as Joe Biden would say, by the way, thank you all for staying so late with the rest of us. When we talked about what you wanted me to talk about, there's a great FDR quote from 1936, where FDR said, "Labor Day symbolizes our determination to achieve an economic freedom for the average man," now he'd say person, which will give his political freedom reality. And I think one of the things we often forget about is that economic freedom is intimately linked with political freedom. And if you don't have a sense of economic security, a sense of ownership in a society, your confidence in the democracy will ebb, and you don't really have the power that free citizens should have in a democracy. There is a wonderful book coming out next year by a young law professor called Ganesh Sitaraman. And the title is The Crisis of the Middle Class Constitution. And it's a very important idea. And if you want to be a real originalist, you go back to the founders, and the founders were acutely aware that if people did not have a stake in their society, a material stake, if we did not have some degree of equality of property ownership, and Lord knows these guys were not complete egalitarians. Heck, we know some of them were slaveholders, but they understood that this document really hung on, and this system hangs on a degree of economic opportunity across the board. And so that's why, and we have talked about this before, you and I, that's why this kind of work and what we do in the next 10 or 12 years will make a big difference. And I think when you look at the rise of the far right in Europe as well, I think it's fair to say, in the Trump campaign, it's a response to a number of factors. One is globalization, where a lot of people feel that the deal they were promised under globalization has not been delivered on. And wherever you stand on trade, that first statement is true. There are a lot of people who have been left out in this period. Second, we talk a lot about immigration. Well, guess what? Our country historically, we've had periods, anti-immigration periods before. We had the Know Nothing movement. We had the Ku Klux Klan rise in the 1920s. Robust economic growth tends to help a lot in settling this problem, and robust and shared economic growth tends to do a lot. And I must say, I loved Ed's point, because we don't speak enough about immigration reform as a way of guaranteeing equal labor rights across the board. And it's why native-born workers actually have an interest in pulling people out of the shadows. A lot of the Trump and far-right supporters are people, I looked this up recently, the late Andrew Greeley, the father Andrew Greeley, used to talk about neighborhood people. There are a lot of neighborhood people in the world. Liberals sometimes can't sympathize with them because liberals are big city metro people. They're trying to escape their small town. And conservatives don't sympathize with them because they say, well, when a community loses its economic purpose, the factories shut down, well, those people should just move out. But there are a lot of people with a real affection for a place and whose civic capital contributes so much to our country. And when you have the kind of unequal economic growth that we have had, those folks get very angry. So I think the reason why ideas in this report are so important is, A, because they could try to pull this campaign back a little bit to specifics. It would be really nice to have a debate on some of the proposals that are contained here. Maybe we'll get there someday. Maybe if we put this whole report in a series of emails, it would get a lot of discussion.
I'll email it to Hillary
in the
and
campaign.
Then leak it.
Have the Russians leak it. Then, but secondly, it's this democratic question. I love Reinhold Niebuhr. He once said, man's capacity for justice makes democracy possible. Man's capacity for injustice makes democracy necessary. That we can get to democracy because we desire a more just society. But we want democracy because of the ability of people to abuse their power. And there's a lot of talk in the world about how the authoritarian countries make decisions quicker and they can get things done. There was a lot of talk like that in the 1930s about how democracies have become inefficient. They can't solve problems. And so I think that it's the task of this generation and the one that comes after to do what FDR and later the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats did, which is to show that democracy is not only a just system, but that it can actually deliver the goods. And the goods, delivering the goods means goods across the board and not just to a narrow group of Americans.
That's incredibly helpful. I'm going to move to questions, which we have a few minutes for. I want to just Before that, note that Ganesh is a CAP Senior Fellow, so thanks for that plug, and I hope everyone buys the book. And if people have questions, if you want to just stand up and identify yourself, that would be great over there. And then try to do, we just have limited time, so just do a brief question.
I'm Mitzi Worth. I'm with the Naval Postgraduate School. I happen to think the most important years in education is from birth through 12th grade. And because that's when both the emotional and the intellectual neurological pathways get created. Listening to a recording of the community, whatever it is, the leadership in Chicago, and they were talking about a food program, and the fifth person, the first 5 people to speak all got on and said people who are teaching preschool need to be better paid. Chicago, the second most expensive city in the world, pays $32,000 a year for preschool teachers. I mean, if ever there is a warped sense, and I guess my question is, how do we think about paying the most important people in terms of education an appropriate valued living wage? Because you want good people to go into that. These kids go in for 2 years and leave because they now have experience and they can get paid elsewhere. Anyway, I think it's an incredibly important question that nobody talks about.
That's an excellent point. I think I'll actually turn it to Professor Blinder to talk about the importance of investments. I always think it's good for economists to talk about the importance of investments in 0 to 5, and then obviously the quality of teaching really impacts the quality of education.
So let me first say that I don't have a very good answer. I don't have an answer for the low wage problem that you correctly point to. Supply and demand tends to generate wages and other prices unless the government intervenes, and in that case that would mean with a lot of money. You're not going to solve that problem, sadly. Now, to Neera's question, I think one of the things we know best about the returns to education is that pre-K education, high quality pre-K education, has enormous payoffs, both for subsequent performance in K through 12, for less incarceration, less crime later, and what economists often put at the top of the list, higher wages, many years later. So you're talking about quote, I don't even know if you should call it educating, whatever you do with 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, stimulating them, stimulating their minds. When they're 35 or something, they earn higher wages on average. And if you do the kind of crass rate of return calculations that economists like to do, or that we sometimes get ridiculed for doing, so forget of any humanitarian or social, or just forget about that and view this as a business proposition. You know, most companies in America would salivate to get those kinds of rate of returns. They can't earn those kinds of returns. There's nothing they can do. So there is, in my mind, no doubt whatsoever that we as a country should be using, where necessary, public monies to make sure that kids from disadvantaged backgrounds, this is not a problem for my grandchildren, they're going to get everything they need. I'll make sure of that. For kids from disadvantaged backgrounds to get this kind of, quote, education, it'll pay back the government very generously. And the only reason we're not doing this, I think, is myopia, right? You educate a 3-year-old and the returns don't start rolling back in until that child is in their 20s and earning a paycheck.
Liz, I actually just want to get you to answer like the specific question about wages, because I think to dovetail off Professor Blinder's comment, the United States stands out in the world for the lack of investment 0 to 5. And if you look at all of our industrialized competitors, all of them are making big investments 0 to 5. In fact, even China and India, the rate of growth in 0 to 5 is far outpacing other countries. And I do think that connects to the wage issue. And so why do you see, you see this everywhere, a Head Start teacher, pre-K teacher, more importantly, a child care professional makes not even close to what a teacher makes, and a teacher, K through 12 teacher, is not even close to other professionals.
Right.
How do you see that, and what can we do to affect that?
Well, and it hasn't been made a priority, like, we've somehow separated it from the education system more broadly, and now it's an add-on almost, and in some ways we should be looking at it as a public good, as part of our infrastructure. And I would say if we're looking at infrastructure investments, why aren't we rolling that into the equation? And often, we meet and talk with workers every day, and often early childhood workers, as was said so eloquently, are the lowest paid, the least valued, often, I would say, predominantly female, people of color. And so I would also inject the argument of collective bargaining yet again, that if more early childhood workers had access to collective bargaining and more of them had union contracts, then their wages would start to go up. And again, bringing people together, more power, leverage in the economy. And we're seeing this at the state level, actually, that providers and workers are starting to come together to lobby for state investment. And so it's almost like a labor management partnership that, obviously one benefits the other. So
Could I just say something?
Sure.
One of the things that sort of troubles me is how we think of the idea of generational equity. And we tend almost always, when those words come up, it's almost always only about, well, we're running up this big debt and it's going to be left to our children and grandchildren.
Yeah.
What we never think about is the investment of the generation that came before us into public goods that actually made us in our generation richer. When you think of, for example, the number of public schools that were built after World War II, when you think of the infrastructure investment, the highway system that Ike built, when you look at also an Ike program, what we were going to put into higher education. And so I do think, and so when Alan says, the investment in those kids pays off, it's not necessarily going to pay off for this generation of taxpayers. It's actually something we're doing for the long-term good of the country. And I do think we need to sort of think again about generational equity and what the current generation is going to leave behind. Yes, we don't want massive debt, but we also want to leave behind, if we could get rid of the debt and we could leave a country in shambles if we don't give the next generation what many of us were given.
Absolutely. Great point. I think we have time for one last question here, or one other question right there.
Hi, John Arnsmeyer, Small Business Majority. Obviously, we feel that small business is at the center of so much. It's half of our economy and creates almost half the jobs in this country, and is central to the stability of communities, particularly disadvantaged communities. We also feel that CAP's not included in this. You've been a great partner, but and Hillary Clinton's talking a lot about small business on the campaign trail. But too often, I think we feel we get left out of the conversation. Which is interesting because there's a huge political benefit. I mean, small business is kind of a mom and apple pie constituency, and yet, we think really, it needs to be integrated in. So I would be interested to hear from one or more of you about how you view, getting small business and entrepreneurship more into the sort of centerpiece of all these issues we're talking about.
I'll ask Deputy Secretary Raskin to address that. I would just note, CAP did a report about a year ago that showed that we've seen a big decline in entrepreneurship, or rate of entrepreneurship, and it's actually really well connected to this rising inequality, because people need to be able to mitigate risks, to be able to be entrepreneurs. And so when they have more risk on them, they're less secure to become small business owners. And it's an important report I recommend to folks. But Sarah?
Sure. So it's an extraordinarily important point, because as we talk about growth and growth in the economy, we want that growth to be sustainable. We want that growth to actually not be a flash in the pan, just a spurt, okay? And that's why the emphasis has always been on inclusive growth. How do we make sure that there is growth in all sectors, across geographies, that it is as much of an even across income level growth as possible. And of course, you leave the free market to its own devices, and you're not going to get that, right? We've seen that. You're not going to get an inclusive growth that is going to occur by itself. Part of the key to getting this inclusive growth comes from small business and entrepreneurship. Of course, every significant job generator started as a small company. So the value of small companies from an economic growth perspective is critically important. From a job creating perspective, they're also very important, because it is these are where our innovations land. Our innovations land in small businesses. That is where the entrepreneurial spirit of our country actually is gathered. And we want to do everything we can to actually encourage those kinds of that kind of entrepreneurship, which, to Neera's point, goes also to the heterogeneity, income disparity problems that we're having, right? Because if you think about the mobility factors in our society, education being one of them, small business, entrepreneurship is another critically important one. And it is through the ability to live in an economy with rules that promote those small businesses that essentially become the important drivers. So it's a point very well taken.
Ed, I'd love your take on just one point that John raised, which is small business development as in communities that are really being left behind in the recovery that we have in cities, et cetera. There's been a lot of discussion about lack of access to capital in urban areas. That is a big challenge for small businesses. Are there specific sets of ideas in that space that policymakers should really think about to make sure small business development is, or small business growth is an area of opportunity for all Americans?
So first, I think this is an absolutely critical area. There's a number of recent studies that looked at mobility and our ability to move if you were poor at birth and move up. And Raj Chetty did this work that said areas where there is more dynamism, areas which have more of this small business and this entrepreneurship, this job creation, these are communities where you're much more likely, even if you're born in poverty, to escape. Those areas which don't have that dynamic properties, that don't have these new businesses, or where you're born is where you'll end up. And so for our economy, if we want to attack this inequality thing, how do we get more of these areas? How do we get more of these gazelles who create a disproportionate number of the jobs? And particularly in inner cities, how do you attract them? How do you get them there? A piece of that, in inner cities in particular, is you got to have infrastructure. Why would I want to work or to set up my business where the roads are broken down, I can't get access to consistent power, the water's polluted, I don't have electricity, I can't get a skilled workforce, I have to worry about public safety. These are all infrastructure, these are all part of business location issues. Access to capital is a big thing. How do we make sure that our banks have incentives to loan money to local communities and to be the source of funding for them? Those are other key parts of that agenda.
That's great. We have gone over time, and I really want to thank the audience for staying with us throughout this and for your questions. And we had a little bit of an abbreviated panel, but I think we made it up in content. So thank you all very much, and thanks for everyone to be part of this really important work.
Thank you.
That we hope frames the next presidential debate. That's what we'll work on. Thanks, everybody.